Now, Starfield is going to boast a large amount of systems that players can partake in that gives a massive amount of customization, such as ship building and ship customization, weapon modding, outposts, and more. But one thing that a lot of these systems have in common is the need for a massive amount of resources. And it seems that Bethesda put a lot more work directly into these different resources than you may think. And if you're enjoying my Starfield coverage, make sure to subscribe. This channel is solely based on Starfield, and we have tons of videos coming soon. Now, one of the most interesting parts about the resource system in Starfield is that it is a direct representation of our elements in real life. And even the way that these resources are shown to us is through their elemental symbol, which is what you would find if you looked at a periodic table. Now, the system still has to be gamified in some way, and they still have to add some progression into the system. So they have actually added the rarity system that is used by weapons, gear, and things like spacesuits into the resource system. So things like finding rare weapons, epic weapons, and legendary weapons is also going to be the same way you go about finding resources. And we know this because in the Starfield showcase, when they showed some of the planets in the star map, we actually get to see the resources available on some of these planets. And in some of this footage, they were in the Parima system, and specifically when looking at a moon in this system called a Parima VA, we got to see 8 different resources, which seem to have a range of every resource rarity. So we had all the way up to legendary resources, and all of these resources shown are real world elements that you can go find if you look at a periodic table. So first off, we have the legendary resource of this moon, which is labeled CS, which is cesium. We have the epic resource, which is labeled Li, which is lithium. Then we have one of the rare resources, which is labeled F for fluorine, and then there are a handful of resources that aren't labeled with a rarity, so these are probably just going to be labeled as common, and one of them is Cu, which is copper. All of these are real world resources, and you can also find all of these on the periodic table. So one of the biggest takeaways is that they are being very realistic with the resource system. Now, not all planets or moons are going to have this much variation in different resources you can find on that body. Some of the planets we've seen actually only have 2 resources, and they both are of the normal tier. And then you have moons like this that have 8 different resources all the way up to the legendary tier. And something else to note with this is that in the UI, when hovering over a planet or a moon, it shows all these resources, and it also shows you how many you have personally discovered. Now, past this system being so interesting because it's following real world elements, all of these resources are also going to be incredibly important for progressing through a vast majority of these systems that give you customization throughout the game. So for instance, when looking at, say, weapon modding, we know that putting mods onto weapons is actually going to take different resources. So for instance, when looking at one of these rifles, if you want to apply a medium magazine, it would take 2 tungsten, 3 lead, which are both kind of base resources, but also 1 sealant. So doing different things throughout the game is not only going to take the base resources, but they're also going to take other elements that seem to either be bought from vendors on different planets or crafted through the crafting system, and that's presumably also going to be taking different base resources. And even to add on top of that, you're also going to need to research the ability to craft a lot of these different items throughout the game. So this medium magazine, you may not know how to put it on weapons or craft it earlier in the game, so you'd have to go to a research station and use probably credits and also more resources to even research that. And that's just when looking at modding for weapons. But then once you get into shipbuilding and outpost building, the amount of resources you're going to need is just going to skyrocket, and you're going to need a much larger variation in resources to be able to craft a lot of these items. Now, every resource I've seen in the footage is something that's present within the real world, but there is the possibility of new elements being created specifically specifically for Starfield. And one of the main reasons I think this is because some of the footage we've seen around the main quest line. And one of the main things we've learned about the main quest line of Starfield is that we are hunting these artifacts. We've seen them in multiple pieces of footage. That one of the first things you do in the game is discover one of these artifacts. And when you bring it to Constellation, they have a handful of these and they kind of connect and start floating around in some of the footage. So they're clearly meant to be pieces of a larger object. And they've also been very much hinting that these are from a long lost alien civilization. But in some of the footage, when your character is finding one of the artifacts, there are these floating rocks and elements around the artifact. So I think it's a pretty good chance that there will be some type of resource tied to these artifacts that we would also be able to gather when searching for these artifacts. And if you want to be a bit more pie in the sky theory, if you also think we're going to be getting space magic from these artifacts, there's a possibility that if all of that ends up being true, that we can get some new elements from finding these artifacts and that you get these space powers. And maybe that finding this new resource or element is also how you progress more into getting those space powers. But that's definitely more of an outlandish theory. But I do think it is much more plausible that there is some type of new element or resource that we will be obtaining throughout the main quest line when searching for these artifacts that was part of this long lost alien civilization. Now, the rarity and scarcity is actually going to play a bigger role in Starfield than resources played in previous Bethesda games, because transferring resources from planet to planet is going to be much more difficult than just filling up your inventory in Skyrim and teleporting or walking to a city. There's only going to be a limited amount of weight you can carry on your spaceship to take it to another planet to sell it to a vendor or use in your outpost. But there are going to be systems that allow you to do this much more efficiently and effectively, meaning these resources are also going to play a pretty big role in the more endgame features. Now, one of the most efficient ways you'll go about harvesting and transporting resources is through your outposts, because you'll be able to make these outposts on basically any planet, and you'll be able to transport resources between all of these different outposts. So probably one of the best ways to actually get your resources to different vendors if you would want to sell them is to make an outpost somewhere close to a major city or settlement on that same planet. Then you would use the transport system between your outposts to take them from one of your resource gathering outposts and transfer to that outpost that's placed near one of those big cities. And in your outpost, you'll be able to make automatic resource gatherers, but there will also be some type of system that will allow you to automatically gather certain resources if you built your outpost near certain creatures, wildlife, or fauna. And with this shipbuilding and outpost systems being more endgame features, so they're going to take a ridiculous amount of credits and resources to get the higher tier versions, I'm wondering if higher tiers of resources are actually going to go up in weight. So maybe if you found a legendary resource, it would always weigh a lot more than lower tier resources to make it so transporting those much more valuable resources is something that you actually can't do a ton of early on. Because when you're more early on in Starfield, you're not going to really have a ship with tons of cargo space, and you're not going to have tons of outposts set up to where you can transfer resources between them. So actually getting those resources where they want to go is actually going to be a pretty big part of your gameplay if you're trying to take part in that side of Starfield. And I am somebody that likes the rarity systems commonly found in RPGs, such as what's being used in Starfield, and I think adding it to the base resource system is just going to add more of a tangible progression system into even just finding these base resources. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.